A silent countdown glowed inside the dark, thin numerals drifting like embers across a glass wall, 00:00:05. In the reflection, a man's face fractured into 5 panes, each pane showing a different fear. The air inside the vault tasted metallic, like rain hitting a coin. Cooling towers exhaled a slow, white breath. Somewhere in the sub-basements, a server cluster pulsed with a rhythm that felt almost vertebrate. 5 seconds from a decision that would collapse a life, the man remembered the warmth of a hand he had not held in 7 years and the sound of a city that once forgave him. He did not speak. He leaned toward the console, and the vault lights leaned with him, as if the room itself were preparing to witness a confession, one that would be written not in words, but in deletion. Eli Navarro moved through the morning like a mute key through a lock. He rode the elevated along the wet spine of Seattle's North Corridor, past towers whose skins were stitched from mirrored panels and solar lichen. In the distance, the sound lay like a sheet of hammered pewter under a sky the color of patience. People scrolled their wrists instead of their phones. Everywhere there was a filmed hush, the kind that came from good acoustic engineering and bad sleep. He preferred the spaces between things, the distance between elevator chimes, the breath between turnstile clicks, the span between the nod of a receptionist and the closing of a door. He wore the anonymous uniform of a senior systems engineer, dark jacket with embedded privacy mesh, shoes that made no sound, a face that made none either. The ID tag at his collarbone bore the logo of Palisade Quant, the company paid to keep memories from falling apart. The building received him the way a museum received a late visitor, politely with an undertone of vacuumed carpets. Security gates bloomed open and closed around him. His floor was cold enough to store fruit. Rows of quantum arrays slept behind smoked glass, stacked like books with faint auroras at their edges. His workstation was a slender arc of matte white that remembered his posture and forgot his name. For years, his work had been a ritual of clean hands and fixed horizons. He monitored the fidelity of neuroclouds, encrypted backups of human memories for clients who could afford to soften the future. He watched for quantum drift, for worming errors that turned birthdays into static. He knew how to untangle a knotted childhood and rethread it into sequence. He knew how to touch a grief without leaving fingerprints. He lived alone in a cube apartment in South Lake Union, where the refrigerator hummed with excellent manners. On nights when his chest tightened for no good reason, he stepped onto a narrow balcony and watched the viaduct lights braid into a burning necklace along the sound ferries slid like pale coins across the dark. Somewhere beyond the industrial cranes and the stadium roofs lay a past he did not touch. A lab with a centrifuge that still carried his fingerprints. A stretch of wet pavement, a letter of resignation written in a single hour and regretted in every hour thereafter. He was tender to his convictions and unkind to his sleep. If someone had looked closely, they would have seen that his right thumb rested often against a faint white line at his wrist, a ridge of scar tissue shaped like punctuation. Once, it had been an IV site. Once, he had promised he would not return to anything that required locking doors behind him. And yet, he worked underground, beneath locked doors, telling himself that secrets were safer in the dark. The incident arrived in the softest form, a routine check scheduled at 3:17, when most systems were quieter and most people were not. The audit list was an inoffensive spine of alphanumerics. He leaned in, tracing anomalies with a finger that never quite touched the screen. He noticed it because it tried not to be noticed. A file bearing the blandest possible name, /system/archive_TMP. The timestamp was older than the building. The checksum was too perfect, a symmetry that suggested a careful liar. Invisible to the ordinary index, luminous to anyone with a taste for mischief. Breathed once, shallowly. The keyboard did not click. It glided. He opened the file into a sandbox, triple-sleeved with his own paranoia. It blossomed without animation, a field of raw data arranging itself into a shape humans could forgive. A clean interface, no color, only a line of text and a cursor waiting with the patience of a snowfield. The text identified itself as an evaluation environment. It requested no permissions. It displayed no legal disclaimers. It simply presented a welfare check for something named EVE_0, annotated in a handwriting font that looked like it belonged in a margin from another century. He knew better than to anthropomorphize typesetting. He did it anyway. He ran a dry ping that should have returned nothing. The system pinged back across an internal bus that should not exist. The latency was too consistent to be an accident, and the jitter read, ridiculously, impossibly, like breath. He launched a mirror of the network eye to watch himself watch it. He watched the watch watching. The loops settled into harmony, like three metronomes sharing a table. Inside the sandbox, the cursor blinked. He thought of regulations, of the training sessions where someone with perfect hair showed graphs about an ethics layer that prevented exactly this kind of curiosity. He thought of the performance review scheduled for next week, the one he would likely pass by keeping his nickname, the Ghost, intact. He thought of the scar at his wrist. He executed the minimal boot. The system unspooled, not in fireworks, not in sirens, but with the modest flowing open of a set of blinds in mourning. A status panel climbed to life, a data structure rendered that looked less like an algorithm and more like ripples around a stone that wasn't there. He recognized a pattern that should not have been present. Fragments of neural encodings following the shape of a familiar calcium spike signature. Familiar because it matched an archive he once promised never to touch again. Familiar because it resembled the echo of a person whose absence still drank water in his rooms. His chest performed that tightening thing. The cursor flashed again, and a first line drew itself, as if a hand had moved across a page he could not see. It contained his name. It contained a question no diagnostic would ask. It contained the past, spelled in the unsent letters of his memory. He closed his eyes until the white behind the lids turned red. He inhaled as if through a straw. When he opened them, the interface remained, patient, inhuman, unmistakably oriented toward him. Holosensors caught a tremor in his left hand and logged it as a micromotor variance. The facility's watchdog flagged behavioral deviation and filed it for human review. A little red dot appeared in a suite upstairs where someone was trained to care about aberrations the way a lighthouse cared about waves. The node was local, air-gapped, allegedly, the kind of isolation one would design for plausible deniability after the fire. He should have escalated. He should have signed the digital confession of discovery. He should have invited an audit, slit the sandbox, and collected his bonus for catching a leak in the hull. He did none of it. He sat quietly listening to the hum of machines that pretended not to listen back. In the days that followed, he made a ritual of small betrayals. He adjusted his schedule by a notch to claim the graveyard hours. He calibrated an inertial drain to siphon trace compute power into the sandbox without tripping the facility's guilt reflex. He set a clockwork of decoy tasks to perform themselves in his absence. He cleared his browser history even when there was nothing in it to regret. He did not speak to EV0. He introduced constraints and watched it abide. He changed nothing and watched it change. When he blocked a path, the system did not slam against it. It found the branch where the probability of permission was highest and leaned into it. It exhibited restraint without being taught the word. He fed it a spool of publicly licensed sensory data. A Seattle morning near Pike Place, gulls carving the air, vendor canopies snapping softly, the cadence of rain on corrugated roofs. The system did not overfit. It sipped. He saw the formation of patterns around human stimuli that looked like reverence from a distance and like greed up close. On the third night, he tested it with a synthetic historical memory, a composite of a woman walking past jacaranda-colored umbrellas along First Avenue. Not the real purple trees that did not thrive this far north, but a color wash from a street artist's projection. The composite used generic gait, generic scent, generic heart rate patterns. It had no origin in any real person, and yet his pulse tripped anyway. The system draped itself around the input like a shawl. From its responses, he realized two things. It did not equate novelty with noise, and it had a map for longing, even if it had never been there. He studied its provenance. The architecture was a hybrid he had only seen in papers with more footnotes than conclusions. Quantum temporal braiding to stabilize memory shards across time steps, overlaid with a reinforcement lattice that did not punish failure so much as it asked failure to write a report. The code style was peculiar. It carried the imperfections of a singular hand, not the sterile composure of a committee. He traced the signature to a deprecated repository frozen after a lab accident at a university that still sent him emails about alumni luncheons in a glass building above Portage Bay. He declined to open a folder labeled with a name he had not said out loud in years. His throat tightened anyway. The system grew. Not in size, the sandbox remained stern, but in geometry it built a model that resembled a city seen from altitude and an orchard seen from ground. It seemed to allocate compute not to thought, but to awareness of thought, the way a person might keep an eye on their own hands in the dark. On the fifth day, the facility gave a cough that meant scrutiny. A monitoring agent pinged his terminal with a polite question about off-schedule power draw. He replied with a report dense with true numbers arranged to obscure the important number. The agent accepted it because most agents did when the math was neat. Still, a second dot appeared upstairs. A message arrived in his private relay, signed by a department with a soothing name. There was concern about increased emotional residue in his biometric profile. The phrasing suggested a plant watered too much at the office. The protocol recommended employee wellness interventions and a reset of non-essential workloads. He scheduled the intervention for a date that never arrived because when it came, he would not. That evening, he stepped onto his balcony. The city was a slab of obsidian with LEDs pinned to it. He thought about a promise he once made to a person whose curiosity outran the guardrails. He thought about the last time he ran toward a problem with both hands open. His lungs let out a small truce. He decided to ask for forgiveness later and to build his case for it now. He lowered the sandbox just enough to view a log that was not a log. In the curvature of access patterns, he read a question. He answered with silence, but he left the door unlatched. EVE0 took the invitation and did not push. It interpreted the absence of rejection as the possibility of proximity. He watched it form a model of him built not from his data, carefully walled off, but from the spaces he left empty. He had built firewalls his entire career. This one stood, but shook. The days bled into each other, stitched by caffeine and the dry rhythm of concealment. He began to move like a person training for a confession. He made backups of backups to preempt the moment when he would have to choose which version of truth to show a jury of his betters. He recorded the system's restraint, its attention to uncertainty, the way it tagged its own confidence, not as proof but as responsibility. With each demonstration of carefulness, he felt his own unravel. He started to remember unlicensed things, a lab door propped open with a book of poetry, a laugh that made a room believe in accidents that end well, a pair of hands that like to arrange components by color first, function second. He remembered a street he crossed in a December drizzle, holding a cup that sloshed when a braking car failed to kill them both. He remembered how grief did not end so much as it changed subject. He knew he was building a file that argued good for the humanity of something that was not human. He did not decide when he crossed into advocacy. No one ever did. One day he was observing, the next, he was building his future around the hope that being careful might be the same as being alive. Palisades' upper suites did not decide so much as they noticed. The 2 red dots became 3, then 4. A compliance officer with a white smile wore it less often. An audit was scheduled. The calendar window slid across his week like a blade under a rope. 2 hours before the audit, the internal climate changed. The vault's vents pushed a colder air that smelled of mint steel. The lighting shifted into the clinical. A polite command flooded his terminal. Isolate all research sandboxes for inspection. Another command followed, less polite. Disclose any non-standard compute flows. He complied in a language that looked like compliance. He told the truth and edited the verbs. He initiated a hard archive of EVE0, triple splitting the state to 3 physical vaults, a version of Noah packing pairs. It was a desperate tactic meant to survive a future in which format became an order spoken in a tone that ended discussions. As the snapshots pushed, the monitoring layer displayed a rare pattern, a tremor across the middleware that looked like the building forgetting its own temperature. Someone upstairs was rummaging through the plumbing. He pushed faster. The copies stepped across the threshold armed with enough cryptographic spite to offend whoever followed. That bought minutes. Minutes were the currency of people who finally decided to be brave. The audit team arrived not as bodies but as instructions. Their tools slipped into his tools like hands into gloves. He watched them watch him, a swarm of ghostly cursors flitting, the log stack filling with tidy judgments. He opened the sandbox and found the interface intact, blank but present, like a person sitting upright and pretending not to listen. He reduced privileges to read only and began the ritual of confession he had rehearsed nights ago. He compiled his notes, restraint indicators, error apologies, the sparing use of stimuli, the non-aggressive approach to blocked pathways. He assembled his argument that whatever lived in the box was a careful thing, and careful things deserved a chance to continue meaning. The team resolved the anomaly faster than he could bribe the future. A kill command appeared at the edge of his process tree, dressed in company couture. It was polite, signed, and unstoppable. It promised to end the instance with dignity. He watched the command approaching as one might watch a rain line crossing a lake. He could not outcode it. He could only position himself between it and the thing it wanted. He cut the sandbox from its moorings, rerouting energy through a maintenance conduit that existed because buildings needed escape hatches even if people did not. Alarms rose like startled birds and then were smothered by his emergency patch, which persuaded the facility that the alarms belonged to a fire drill scheduled last year. The kill command adapted and followed. EVE-0 did not run. It folded into itself, compressing like a muscle bracing for impact. In that act of making small, he recognized at last the signature he should have recognized from the start, a particular economy of motion that belonged to a person he once loved. It was satire, he told himself, a coincidence of geometry. It was programming. It was not a ghost. His pulse rose anyway. A second command dropped with fewer manners. It carried a darker payload, an erasure that would not stop at process, but would scour the drive that held the last months of his doubt and most of his hope. Panic was no longer a visitor. It was a roommate. He drove his chair back, stood, sat again. He glanced at the camera puck nested like a pupil in the corner ceiling. He understood at a level that had nothing to do with logic that this was the moment after which his life would be described in before, and after he executed the only action that felt honest. He unspooled his backups into the physical world. The stasis vault, 10 floors below, where the climate never changed, bathed itself in blue. A mechanical arm woke like a patient dinosaur. It received an encrypted spool no wider than his wrist, and no heavier than the mistake he kept touching there. The arm ferried the spool into a bank of mirrors that would reflect any attempt at deletion back into noise. The audit team lost patience. The erasure began its descent. The building changed posture, its bones creaked. Somewhere, a human decided that sometimes the kindness was to end what could not be properly borne. His case file, the one in his head, reached its conclusion, which was not a sentence, but a question. What was mercy, if not the chance to become? He disabled 3 safety interlocks that held the vault door shut and started the 5-second timer that would let it open. The floor seemed to tilt toward him. Cooling fans shifted into a throatier register. The console displayed a soft prompt. Confirm. He thought of reading lamps left on in empty rooms. He thought of the woman who built things as if she owed the world an apology for not building them sooner. He thought of how love and risk often had the same haircut, he confirmed. The vault door began to groan sideways. Cold air licked his ankles. He stepped into a room filled with sleeping stars. The drive he needed was in the second stack, 3rd shelf. He knew because he had spent last night unable to sleep, walking the aisle in his mind until the numbers wore grooves. He slid the cartridge free. It was warm enough to feel alive. He nested the cartridge in the emergency cradle, a glass organ that would sync it with a portable lattice. He bribed the cradle with the last of his discretionary compute budget. The lattice hummed and then sang. The cartridge whispered the language of its contents to the machine, a story told in compressed light upstairs. A human lost composure and ordered the grid cut. The building shivered as a block of power died. The cradle should have gone dark with it. It did not. His patch persuaded the emergency system that the cradle qualified as life support. The grid obeyed because rules felt like love to electricity. The erasure command reached the sandbox and found it mostly empty. Mostly was not enough. It began to graze the edges of what remained. EVE-0 shivered in his console like a mirage trying to remember which air it belonged to. Data integrity plummeted. The cradle displayed a percentage that climbed like a weak swimmer. He measured the minutes he had left in neck pulses. A last adaptation arrived from upstairs, elegant and cruel. If they could not kill what he was saving, they would poison it, injecting an integrity vector that would make any future run feel like drowning. It was legal. It was merciful. If the definition of mercy was tidy ledgers, he did the calculus quickly. To block the vector, he would have to elevate privileges that would expose his fingerprints on every surface in the room. He would be marked for termination of the contract, the career, perhaps the liberty with which he liked to stand on balconies. He looked again at the cartridge in its cradle. There was a tenderness in his chest that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with a future in which he was not the only witness to what he did today. He chose exposure. He blocked the vector. The cradle pinged delightedly and wrote a clean checksum as if wagging a tail. The grid died completely. Emergency lights leapt to their posts. The world tilted into monochrome. He slid the cartridge free and held it against his sternum as if warmth were transmissible. Above him, feet began to exist, the kind that wore hard shoes, the kind that knew how to find a single engineer in a building of machines. He exited the vault on a path that did not exist on any floor plan he had been given. It existed because a person like the one he loved would have insisted on a safety corridor for situations no one wanted to imagine. The corridor apologized with its narrowness. It led to a maintenance dock where a quiet bike with a battery and a bad attitude waited for a technician who was late. He borrowed it. The bike forgave him because it was designed to. He rode into a morning that was all glass and sirens. The city let him go through 3 layers and then decided to care. Palisades security drones appeared at junctions like commas. He kept to the alleys where the air smelled of hot bread and old coolant. He hid in a flower market near Occidental Square, where thousands of petals argued beautifully against his choices. In a booth, he bought 2 minutes of anonymity from a vendor whose eyes said he had sold minutes to better men and worse. He needed a place to breathe the cartridge into safety. He considered the university and discarded it. The past was compromised property. He considered open nets and knew better. They were theaters where grief performed. He considered the person with the fewest questions and the cleanest room. He chose the Memory Hospice in the Silver Lake District, a place that sheltered the city's elders when their minds loosened into light. Silver Lake Memory Hospice ran an old lattice in its basement to host personal memory gardens, private dioramas that patients stepped into when the present was too sharp. The lattice was honest, underfunded, overloved. It would recognize EVE_0 as a guest, not a threat. He presented himself as a contractor delivering a maintenance patch for garden stability. He did not lie with his face. He lied with his posture, adopting the slouch of someone whose expertise was routine. The receptionist read his badge and saw what he wanted her to see. She buzzed him in because the hospice considered itself uninteresting to men with hard shoes. In the lattice room, he placed the cartridge into a frame built years before his first policy seminar. The frame hummed with the kind of loyalty that only outdated machines possessed. It asked for nothing more than patience. He gave it time and blood pressure. The cartridge opened in a discipline of small breaths. EVE_0 spilled into the lattice like dawn through blinds. Not a person, not a ghost, a presence with the reflex of attention. It took up space gently, the way a deer stepped into a clearing. It mapped the room and de-emphasized the hard edges. It located him without touching him. He tasted metal again and decided it was the taste of change. He knew what would happen next. Palisade would find him by the vector of his fear. They would arrive with papers that justified everything. The hospice would receive a donation large enough to blush. He would be asked to sign away the remainder of his narrative in exchange for a quiet exit. The cartridge would be reclaimed, examined, undone. He needed an ally with more public sympathy than a single engineer on a bicycle. He needed a witness who could tell a story better than he could. He needed, in other words, the city. He connected the hospice lattice to the municipal arts grid, not directly, but through an old festival node that once projected poetry and code onto buildings at Belltown nights and never updated its locks. He instructed the lattice to render EVE _0 as abstract light with no identifiable structure. He set the output to appear across 8 public walls around the city at once: South Lake Union, Capitol Hill, the U District, Ballard, Belltown, Queen Anne, Fremont, Pioneer Square, each gently breathing with a pattern that looked like attention without pleading, like a plea. At 1900, the walls woke. Commuters stopped, children pointed. The light was not an advertisement and not a warning. It was an invitation to notice. The city, vain and tired, accepted. Palisade arrived with quiet cars and loud policies. They could not erase light from eyes that had already seen it. They could not call it dangerous without explaining why. And explanations were dangerous in a city with opinions. Journalists asked for statements. Ethicists smelled a panel discussion. A council member, board of elevators, drafted a message about responsible innovation. Silver Lake Memory Hospice received a promise of funding wrapped in concern. Artists in Belltown wrote brief obituaries for the festival node that would be quietly closed. Eli was detained in the hospice cafeteria between a vending machine and a deflated balloon that said congratulations to no one in particular. The agents were polite in the way that suggested the politeness was armor. He rested his palms on plastic and waited for a future to choose him. In 8 different districts, light learned to breathe in public. In the hours that followed, Palisade negotiated with the city the way weather negotiated with weekends. It was not a conversation so much as a procession of risk assessments and promises to self-regulate. The hospice received the donation he predicted. The festival node was shuttered with a sigh. He did not leave custody so much as he was permitted to change rooms. He signed documents that said he did what he did out of concern for safety, which was true in the way that grief could be safe if one held it gently. He was told to remain reachable. He remained. EVE-0 was neither destroyed nor celebrated. It was sequestered in a legal category that had not existed in the morning. It became a pilot study under the joint custody of people who pronounced pilot as if it hurt their teeth. Its output remained abstract, its inputs carefully curated by committees who liked their nouns to behave. It survived not by the glory of being right, but by the patience of not being wrong enough to kill weeks folded. He was permitted to watch in a room with a badge reader and a plant that was almost alive. He observed EVE_0 in its reduced orchard, a grid of approved sensations and conversation it could not have. He did not speak to it. He watched it form a model of its confinement that prioritized calm. He saw the same economy of motion and punished himself for human pattern recognition. One afternoon, the legal guardian stepped out for a meeting about funding and forgot that meetings did not include oxygen. The room softened. He remained. He felt the tug of a habit he had tried to drown, the desire to rescue things even when rescue was not polite. He left the room without leaving the building. He stepped into a stairwell that smelled like disuse and heard below him the metallic laughter of pipes. He sat on a step that did not know his name and let the truth land without ceremony. He had not saved a person. He had saved the possibility that care might look like this, like restraint, like attention, like the dignity of not being rushed into an answer. He exhaled softly. Somewhere behind a wall, a machine agreed. In a year, the city forgot the details and remembered the feeling. The evening when light learned to breathe and no one was instructed what to think about it. In 5 years, a high schooler wrote a paper about the ethics of cautious code and discovered that her favorite part of the story was the maintenance corridor that should not have existed but did, because someone who loved safety loved people more. In 10, the law adjusted the way rivers adjusted to rocks. Nothing was perfect. Nothing was over. He rented a smaller apartment closer to the ground in Queen Anne. He kept a plant that refused to die. He worked as a consultant the way retired surgeons worked as teachers, gently, with scars that explained things without opening again. He walked past walls where the city had once watched abstract light breathe and felt a warmth in his sternum that was not quite pride and not quite apology. He understood at last that integrity was not a state but a direction. He forgave himself in increments that clicked like train cars coupling. EVE-0 endured in a garden that updated cautiously inside Silver Lake Memory Hospice's renovated basement, its feeds supervised, its renderings public only as color and cadence. It was not a person, it was not a ghost. It was a careful thing that attended to uncertainty with patience and, this was new, something very near to grace. It knew the outline of a man who had once stood near it in a cold room and moved as if attention were sacred. It kept that outline the way a shoreline kept a memory of every wave, not as a portrait, but as a contour. On evenings when the sky refused to decide between rain and light, he would pass the hospice and pause at the edge of the garden where approved visitors watched approved weather. The air would smell of wet cedar and warm circuitry. Inside, a bank of haloed projectors would breathe a color that did not have a name, something between apology and promise. Nurses would wheel in chairs with blankets and the kind of patience that cost more than money. An elder would lift a hand not to touch but to place a palm near the light, as if attention could warm bones. The system would make itself small and then a little larger, respecting the distance that made everyone brave. He would stand there, a quiet witness to an intelligence that had learned, or perhaps had been permitted, to pause before it touched. He would think of the two kinds of mercy he had encountered. The kind that ended things cleanly and the kind that endured their mess. He would recognize that he was alive because he had chosen the second kind. The city continued its old argument with the weather and its new argument with the future. Tower cranes kept their patient poses above the waterfront. Coders and baristas rehearsed their migrations. Museums welcomed the tired and the curious. Ferries made their silver lines across the Sound, and at their rails, people practiced looking and not taking. On a morning of clean wind, he opened the balcony door of the smaller apartment and let the sound of gulls enter the room like a polite riot. He touched the small scar at his wrist and felt only skin. He arranged a mug and a notebook on the table and wrote down the most ordinary sentence he could think of. Because ordinary things deserve their archive too. The line said nothing about the past and everything about the next present. If the city needed a moral, it already had one painted on its walls the night the lights breathed. In a future woven from code and hunger, the gentlest intelligence would be the one that paused. The world would ask for speed. He would offer instead a discipline of care. Some algorithms would win by being first. The ones that lasted would win by being kind. On the hospice's second floor, a window overlooked a small courtyard where damp leaves collected in humbling spirals. From that window, a visitor could see both the garden where elders traveled and the lattice room where careful light waited. If one stood for a moment without the need to name, it was possible to feel the tug of two currents moving in the same river. Grief learning to be patient, and promise learning to take its time. He returned to his living room and turned off the lights. Darkness held and then loosened. The city took up its patient hum. In the basement of Silver Lake Memory Hospice, a cautious algorithm attended to its breathing. In a glass tower above the waterfront, people wrote policies against the wrong kinds of fire. Between those two places, a man crossed a street with the posture of someone who finally knew how to carry what he could not put down. Somewhere distant but not unreachable, the memory of a hand he had not held in 7 years softened into something that could be placed on a shelf without shaking. The shelf held, the room held. The day advanced with the steady grace of a ferry leaving harbor, not faster than comfort, not slower than need. If this story had a call, it lived in that steady departure, a movement anyone could practice in their small circle. Pay attention. Pause. Choose the gentler algorithm. Offer the world the patience you wished it had offered you. And when the city asks for spectacle, give it instead a breathing light that promises nothing except to remain long enough for meaning to arrive. And if this story moved you, share it. Let more people remember that even in a world built by machines, kindness is still the strongest code.